All right, whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and kick us off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar and panel discussion with charter leaders on charter and district responses to COVID-19 school closures. I'm Bree Deso, the practitioner in residence at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and I'm joined by Alice Apalka, research analyst at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and Beth Clifford, the policy analyst at Public Impact. We're excited to be here with you today and are going to be reviewing some of the research that we did studying the effect of spring closures due to COVID on charter and district networks. So we will go ahead and dive on into what we found. So today what we'll be reviewing is our research approach. We'll look at findings from a representative sample of both charter schools and district schools across the country. We'll look at some deep dive studies of charters and districts across the country from a smaller sample set, and then we'll talk briefly about the implications for this year. We've all lived this experience, but just as a recap, this March, as we all know, schools across the country closed in an effort to limit the spread of COVID-19. What we know is that all of these closures meant students moving to remote learning and learning at home. But all of this happened with very, very little time to plan or anticipate. And so a lot of that was happening over the spring. So CERPE, the Center on Reinventing Public Education, we began documenting how the country's largest districts and charter operators are responding. And we've been doing that on a weekly basis since the third week of March. And building off that research, the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools and Public Impact worked together to study how charter school operators have responded to the COVID closures as well nationwide. So in terms of CERPE's approach, what we have done is we've got a couple different types of studies ongoing, and they all inform the data we'll share with you today. In partnership with RAND, we generated a sample of 477 districts that are statistically representative of all districts nationwide. It did include a couple of districts in a different database that, as I mentioned, we've been using to study districts and CMOs on a weekly basis. In order to inform this information, what we looked at were plans or information posted on district websites, as well as district social media outlets. And we also looked for general media coverage as well. In terms of coding, we developed typology to code indicators across 15 different indicators, and we've got a description of that in the appendix if you're interested. And then some other research that we've been doing in addition to this larger representative sample is we've done a deep dive database of, in the spring, it was 82 districts and 18 charter management organizations. We updated this on a weekly basis. And we also informed a database that tracked state COVID guidance. We've done one-on-one interviews with parents and case studies of districts and charter operators' responses. We've actually grown this into this fall to now represent 106 districts and 18 charter management organizations as we've studied their approach to reopening the school year.
Awesome, thanks, Bree. So while CERPE was getting us a great picture of how districts were responding and large CMOs were responding to the spring, Public Impact and the National Alliance decided to get a better view of how the charter sector as a whole was responding to spring COVID closures. So similar to CERPE, we pulled a nationally representative sample of CMOs that included 325 freestanding charter schools and 31 network operators, including both CMOs and EMOs. We reviewed operators' publicly posted plans, similar to CERPE, by searching through operators' websites and social media pages, primarily Facebook and Twitter. And if we could not find a publicly posted plan on how closure would work, we left the prioritized indicators blank and noted in a descriptive overview indicator that the operator did not yet have a publicly posted plan at the time of publication. Once we completed our review of all operators and analyzed the results, we compared the data on 8 indicators of CERPE's district analysis from the spring. And we looked at a series of indicators following SERP's lead. And these covered curriculum, instruction, progress monitoring like attendance and grading structures, and technology distribution to ensure access to digital learning for all students. Each were coded according to a standard response list in line with SERP's, typically on a yes, no, or all grades, some grades basis. And you can see our full code book in the full text of our report or in the appendix of these slides. As is with any scan that primarily relies on desk research, there are obvious limitations to the study, the main one being that our data sources cannot provide us with complete information. For one, we were not able to access online resources protected by a password or a portal login. And we also could not capture direct communication sent to families from the district via email or phone or personal communication. We also cannot ensure that the operator followed through on every aspect of the written plan in implementation, especially since the conditions were rapidly changing in the spring, as we all experienced and know. This data, therefore, should not be interpreted as a proxy for how charter operators actually responded in the spring. It should just be a general feel for how the sector responded as a whole. So I'm about to go deeper into each of these findings, but here's an overview of our key findings that we highlighted in the report. We found areas where charter operators did more, mainly in expecting teachers to provide direct instruction to students, but also we found areas where charter operators did less than district schools. And we mainly found gaps consistent across both charter and district schools and called for more action on these fronts heading into the fall. These two areas were primarily in communicating supports for students with special learning needs and closing the digital divide to ensure access to remote learning for all students. So the first main finding had to do with instruction. On two key components of instruction, charter schools surpassed districts in reaching students by expecting teachers to continue providing instruction throughout the spring and by expecting them to provide that real-time instruction or live, though not in person, at least part of the time throughout the spring. We know that direct teacher instruction, especially real-time live learning, is important for all students to minimize learning loss, but especially for our most vulnerable students. So we felt like this finding was one really important to highlight. We found that 74% of charter operators expected teachers to provide instruction during closures, and compared with just 47% of school districts. And further, 38% of charter operators expected live instruction or synchronous instruction compared to 22% of districts. Charter schools were also more likely to expect teachers to check in regularly with students and track attendance throughout the spring. However, it's important to note that although we saw higher expectations from charter operators on instruction, the percentage of charter schools expecting live instruction and attendance still fell below 40%. So there was more to be due on that front. The second main finding that we elevated was that both charter schools and districts must do more to close the digital divide this school year. According to a June report from the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools, internet and device need is similar across charter and district school students. About 1 in 5 of every charter school student and district school student lacked internet access, and approximately 1 in 8 lacked a device at home. However, the majority of district and charter operators did not provide internet or device access for its students or communicate online about the distribution from our collective reviews. Approximately 8% of charter operators reported providing at-home hotspots, and another 2% provided community hotspots from our review. Charters may do more than what was reported, though, as about half of our operators did not provide any information at all on internet connection. So they may have been communicating directly with families about how to access Wi-Fi. And then we found that 32% of charter operators reported providing devices to all students and another 14% to some students. For about 40% did not mention device distribution and reopening plans. So again, that may have been communicated privately, but still large gaps. We hypothesized that one of the main differences, or one of the main reasons behind the difference between district and charter school networks in this response particularly may be that larger districts and larger CMOs may have more resources to purchase connections for their students than smaller single site schools during the spring, which smaller single site and standalone charters comprise the majority of our organizations reviewed. But again, regardless, large gaps remained in both district and charter school responses on the digital divide in the spring. And in our report, we called for the expansion of technology access as an essential priority for the summer heading into next school year. And then our last finding was on another major gap, which was about communication for supporting students with disabilities through remote learning. We found that only 38% of operators clearly communicated on their websites or social media about how schools would be supporting students with disabilities through that transition. And similarly, only 41% of districts were found to do that in SERPI's analysis. We know that student needs and appropriate services vary greatly with the shift to at-home learning, but especially for students with disabilities, clear resources that communicate modifications are needed to ensure equitable access to instruction. You may read more about all of these findings in our report on the Alliance's website, which includes our full reported results as well. However, we felt that the data only just told part of the story because of the limitations noted. For that reason, in our report, we profiled 5 charter schools that are a mix of independent charter schools and small and growing CMOs across the country in 2 to 3 page vignettes that tell the stories of how they transitioned in spring. We interviewed leaders, parents, and teachers to form these stories, and we feel that together with the data, they provide a more complete picture of how charter schools responded in the spring. We encourage you to check out that report on the Alliance's website. And now I'll hand it back over to Alice to talk more about SERPI's analysis.
Great, thank you. So like Bree mentioned at the beginning, in addition to the representative sample analysis, we wanted to share a little more detail on CMO approaches to remote learning as compared to district approaches over time. And so alongside that representative sample database, SERPI also tracked a set of 82 school districts and 18 CMOs, which were generally larger urban districts and the largest CMOs on a week-by-week basis through the spring as remote learning plans evolved. And so we call this the deep dive database. And we use the same typology as the representative sample database, but just over time. We've also transitioned this deeper dive database to capture indicators from the summer and fall, tracking an extended set of indicators on fall reopening plans. Next slide. So a little more on this deep dive study. Like we said, it's not representative of all school districts or CMOs across the country in the way the other data set is. So this is generally larger districts, though it also captures a range. And we also included some districts that just took more innovative approaches that we wanted to track. And so the average number of students in those districts was 110,000. So mostly larger, but we also included districts like Beverly, Massachusetts, which was only 1,300 students, as well as New York City Department of Education. So a pretty wide range was included in this database. And then on the CMOs, we also, it was from a sample of the highest enrollment CMOs in the country. So it was 18 total across 17 different states. Next slide. So you can see here the sample of the 18 different CMOs we reviewed, so a lot of the kind of bigger names, including KIP from different regions, Success Academy, IDEA in the South and Southeast, Yes Prep, and many others. So this was kind of the group that we looked at, the same methodology, checking district websites. So to quickly review the key findings, which we'll dig into a little bit more through some charts and graphs to follow. But overall, the findings from the spring deep dive generally mirror what we saw in the representative sample. So just to skim through, similarly, synchronous instruction, so live real-time instruction in the spring was not widespread generally across districts and charters. We saw that in general, students were receiving much fewer instructional minutes than during a typical school day this spring. As Beth said, access to devices and internet really varied across the districts and CMOs. It was a real struggle for districts and CMOs that were not already one-to-one to access devices and then roll them out to students, especially in a timely way during spring remote learning. Many districts didn't track attendance or provide grades in a formal way during spring closures. And a lot of that was, given access to tech and internet, a desire to, do no harm to students in that situation. And often many districts just provided grades to improve where students were in March, so kind of more like an extra credit during spring learning. And lastly, students with disabilities and English language learners were often, there wasn't a lot of information on district and CMO plans in a lot of specifics, which mirrors a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence that we heard across the country about the real challenges that schools had with serving students with different needs. And I think it's important to note before we dig into the rest of the charts, just that all of these findings we coded them based on the district or CMO wide expectations. So while there are lots and lots of stories of teachers in many districts that were providing live instruction over Zoom and really stepping up to make sure students got what they needed, we only coded for what we could tell was the expectation across the board. So that's just one thing when you're interpreting those charts to mention. But to sum up, what we really observed is that offerings this spring were often less than typical, often kind of optional for students, and placed a lot of responsibility on parents to help students navigate the resources shared or whatever was shared from schools. And districts and CMOs, we observed, really worked hard to ensure students got the meals they needed and other basic resources. But the main story on instruction from what we could glean from these plans is that while it definitely got better over time, like I said, it was less than typical. Move on to the next slide here. So to dig into the data a little more, this chart shows the evolution of the 82 districts, their remote learning plans between early April and the end of May. So the blue chart is, or the blue lines are the end of May. So you can see that districts generally provided more and more in terms of instruction and support to students as the spring wore on. So most districts started by providing just general resources and work packets or assignments from teachers through some kind of an LMS like Schoology at the beginning. But as they were able to kind of train teachers and get devices to students, generally they're providing more instruction by the end. So by the end of May, 60% of school districts were providing curriculum, some kind of instruction, whether live or pre-recorded, and some form of progress monitoring for student work. So whether that was grading or just other indication of teachers tracking or providing feedback to student work. But even by late spring, that's still 40% of districts that are only providing optional assignments without necessarily instruction from teachers. And on the CMO side, CMOs are generally faster to provide more comprehensive learning plans. And by the end of spring, you can see that the comprehensive plans, which included instruction and progress monitoring along with curriculum, was much more common than in districts. So by early April, already 44% of CMOs are providing instruction to students and tracking progress, so bringing school online fairly quickly. And then by the end of May, 78% of CMOs are providing curriculum, instruction, and progress monitoring, compared to 61% of school districts. And in general, CMOs were also a bit more likely to provide touch points on student work and touch points with students than districts were. So practices like providing student feedback, feedback on student work, and check-ins with students were fairly common across the board, but a little bit more common at CMOs. But still only half of CMOs or district schools required some kind of formal grading during last spring. And like we said, often that was related to equity concerns around access to curriculum. And so a couple of sort of strategies we would see is many CMOs kept in touch with students by requiring teachers to provide frequent one-to-one check-ins. So we saw a lot of examples of CMOs asking certain teachers to call students once per week or hold office hours for students to check in with them. And as we'll get into in the next slide, this is something that often teachers would have divvied up between them on the roles, since it took quite a bit of time to do it. Another example we would see is that if schools had an advisory period, sometimes that would transition online. And so the homeroom teacher would be a checkpoint for students to connect with each other and with the teacher. And as I noted just on the previous slide, we know that that switch to remote learning was a big change and created a lot of work for teachers to translate their work into a totally new context while also keeping connections with students through a pandemic. And especially at the beginning of the pandemic, the job of connecting with students, we heard anecdotally, would sometimes take teachers hours per day to make sure that students knew where they were supposed to be getting their assignments, making sure students had devices they need, checking in on kind of their family situation. That kind of stuff was a big job. And we did see some CMOs use some innovative staffing flexibilities to make this work. And so the main thing we saw was just more collaboration across schools and kind of co-teaching strategies. So several examples of CMOs that encouraged schools to distribute teacher tasks for more efficiency. So we saw from the beginning, Success Academy created a model where teachers would pair up and then split instruction. So one teacher would take on the role of teaching a larger group of students synchronously, while other teachers would focus on doing that work of check-ins and grading and helping prepare instruction. Or at Achievement First, one teacher would lead, one teacher per grade level would lead instructions while others would do that similar check-in or prep role. And again, DSST was another network where advisors took on the role of check-ins. Other teachers could step up to more instruction to divvy up those time responsibilities. And we also saw teachers collaborate across network sites as well. So we saw at Rocket Ship, so teacher leaders would record example lessons and lead PD. So really taking full advantage of talents on staff and making sure that teachers were supporting each other to adapt to the new circumstances. So we saw a lot of kind of innovative strategies there. And kind of one deeper dive here, we provide an example of Achievement First. So they used a lot of these creative staffing strategies while preserving flexibilities for teachers during this challenging time, and laid that out really clearly in public documents, which was very helpful for us as researchers. But a couple examples of that is they established a maximum on time for teachers, kind of a maximum amount of time per day that they should be teaching, having meetings, kind of doing check-ins with students, while making sure teachers also still had prep time in their day. And then they also encourage schools to create flexibilities for teachers, like recording meetings for teachers to watch later, or assigning teachers who had a demanding home situation, like their own children, to help support their remote learning, to do more of that flexible work like grading or student check-ins that they could kind of slot in during the day in different periods to make the new situation work for them. And then they similarly did, like we shared in previous examples, distributing instructional roles versus other roles to teachers to do check-ins, grading, lesson prep, that kind of stuff. So there are some interesting strategies we saw on making this new model work online. And lastly, of the spring findings, one kind of gap we did see was in the level of instruction across grade levels. So we had two ways that we tracked the level of instruction happening, and that was instruction, or the different indicators for some grade levels versus all grade levels. And so you can see on this chart that when accounting for districts or CMOs providing instruction, synchronous instruction, or feedback to all students versus just some students, there's usually a jump up between all to some. And what that was, we found was that typically districts and CMOs that were only providing a comprehensive plan to some grade levels were providing it to secondary grades, like just middle school and high school. So that was one pattern we observed, is that schools, districts, and CMOs really struggled to figure out how to do the remote learning for the youngest students in elementary level. And that was a challenge we saw definitely carry through across the board for different grade levels. All right, well, I'm going to hand it off to Bree. Let's talk about summer and fall findings.
Oh, you're on mute, Bree.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. And as we wrap up this presentation, we wanted to just recognize that this research was done that we just presented over the spring, and time is moving fast. And so we have, since this research has come out, we've got just a couple findings from summer and fall reopening planning that we thought we would end on as we wrap up into our conclusions. So a quick summary of what we found about summer school. It did feel that most districts and about half of CMOs that we reviewed did provide summer school options over the summer, and almost all of those opportunities were virtual. And generally, it was a pretty traditional approach. We were looking to see if districts or CMOs at least communicated seeing the summer period as a time to pilot or test strategies that they might put in place over the fall. We didn't see much of that language, but what we saw was districts generally and CMOs generally working to do what summer school has done in the past, to prioritize academic review and especially credit recovery for older students. Move on to the next slide. And in terms of this fall, what we have found for CMOs, 17 of the 18 CMOs that we studied started the year remotely, which is actually a significantly higher percentage than the national average, and even a higher percentage than the urban districts that we've been tracking. And so remote really was prioritized by at least the CMOs that we studied. And what we found was since this spring, CMOs are providing even more, and again, just communicating, at least providing even more consistency, and are kind of returning to a more typical school day, albeit remotely. And so instruction, attendance, grading, and teacher check-ins were all communicated with the same or more frequency for this new school year. Two just mentions as we look forward into this next year. There are lots of great examples coming out of what we saw from CMOs, but the Noble Network of Charter Schools, what we appreciated that they shared were very clear expectations for families and students to learn about what they could expect to change and stay the same in a remote classroom. And they linked all of this to their classroom tenets and guiding philosophy. Interestingly, Noble plans to open fully asynchronous instruction, and with intentionality has chosen to not provide synchronous instruction from a lens of access. And so that has been a great example of a strong communication of why a network is choosing to do what it's doing, so families and we, the general public, can understand that. The other promising practice on the next slide that I wanted to share is from Summit Public Schools in Washington. This network met one-on-one with families of students with special needs before the year, and they are working to adjust IEPs for the fully virtual setting. This is just a great example of being responsive and proactive and acknowledging the differences in this year. And a Summit Washington parent that we spoke with just spoke to how much that meeting helped for her to know what to expect for her son, and how she and her son got to participate in that process, and how it felt very empowering for him. So we are always looking for bright spots, especially around serving students with special needs, which is a often under communicated group. And so this was a great one. So as we move on to the next slide, in conclusion, what are the implications for us moving forward? I think we are finding as we go into the first month or so of school that we will likely be remote, or at least partially remote, for the foreseeable future. And I think we all know this, but what we have at our advantage in the charter sector is the ability to exercise a little more autonomy and innovation. And so just, our encouragement would be to continue to take advantage of that, and especially do this through the frame of creating more equitable learning for all students and trying to really compress the gaps that we see widening right now during remote learning. So some really basic things, and all of these are I'm sure what everyone here knows. Of course, access to an internet connected device is very, very important. Making sure that high quality instruction is present, really focusing on the instructional learning experience, and not getting too stuck in the weeds of operations and logistics, which is so easy to do. And just naming that so much of learning happens through relationship. And so making sure students stay connected to a caring adult or adults is really critical to their engagement and investment. And I think we all know these things, but these things really stood out as we looked at the research. And other students, just to name, there are more vulnerable populations within the context we serve. Some students need more than just technological devices. They actually will probably need some kind of in-person location and or adult supervision to do their remote work. If a student is experiencing homelessness, they may not have access to a power outlet to plug things into. They may not have access to a place to even go to do their work that's quiet and calm. And many students, as we know, as parents, are frontline workers or are just working either in person or remotely right now themselves. And so the remote option, we believe, is best accompanied by an in-person option, even if it's just with adult supervision. Just to reiterate, to provide clarity on remote accommodations for learning disabilities and updating IEPs. And also to name that students who are learning English, really, there was very little information this spring about how they were being supported, with notable exception of some great CMO work being done in this area. But just the more that school networks are providing access to materials that are translated and adults who speak their home language is very, very, very important. And our final slide here on implications is just to name, there are a lot of supports for families that we've seen emerge as potential great practices or kind of really non-negotiable practices. We would recommend just continue to increase communication on sites, just because there are so many different ways for families and extended members of families to get the information needed. And really being clear. I think Noble provided a good example of what parents can expect. There are so many questions and so many surveys showing parents want more information from their schools. Being very transparent about services for students with disabilities and English language learners, again, so families can know what is happening and what to expect, so that if it's not happening, they can advocate for those services. We have seen that it is so critical for any school to be building strategic partnerships, as I think almost all of us are doing, with community-based organizations to provide supplemental services, because schools just cannot do this alone and we have limited resources. So really leveraging those relationships feel incredibly important this year. Continuing to think of parents as often the kind of educational guardian or learning guardian of their student, since they're often at home. And so just being thoughtful about more training and professional development to parents, as much as you sometimes think about providing to teachers, actually. We have seen districts really increase their, districts and CMOs increase their surveying of families, and it's a bright spot seeing districts gather more information from their families, and I don't think that should stop. I think that this is probably continuing to happen, but just regular surveys to gather pulse checks on where families are and students seem critical to know how to make decisions moving forward. Alice covered this, but certainly redefining roles and responsibilities, including at the central office if you're part of a network, is something that charters can often do with a little bit more fluidity, and is something that we really want to learn from. And so the more that you all are doing that, and the more that you're sharing it online so we can learn about it and promote it to better impact the field, we would be grateful. And then, the last thing I'll close on is just that, this is probably easier said than done, but seeking funding to pilot more innovations in the field, just as I mentioned at the very beginning, we have an opportunity to innovate. That's the role that charters often play in spaces, and to pilot and to test. And there's just, I can't think of a time where it's more important to do this right now, where we are watching and experiencing inequitable gaps widen dramatically into remote learning. And the more that we can learn from the charter sector's innovation in this area, and work to support other systems in doing this, the better. So just a plea there, and I hope that there's funding for it. I think there is. So with that, I think we have a couple more just kind of concluding slides. We have our citations. We have our appendix here. And we'll just end on what our organizations are, and just say, thank you. And we have our websites there if you need to reach out to us with any more questions. And we will see you at our panel with actual leaders who are doing this work on the ground, so we can all learn from them. So I want to thank Alice and Beth and everyone. I want to thank everyone who's watching this, doing this work on the ground. There is, in my opinion, nothing more important than what you're doing right now. So just thank you.
Thank you.